I had always looked forward to our family gatherings, the warmth, the chatter, and the laughter that filled every corner of my grandmother's house. But that day, as I walked through the familiar doorway, I felt an unfamiliar tightness in my chest. I smiled, waving at cousins and aunts, trying to shake off the tiny voice in my head warning me that something was off. My name is Lila, and I've spent years building my life with care, pursuing my passions, and embracing the choices that make me who I am. I've always prided myself on being independent, confident, and unapologetically myself. Yet in that moment, I realized how fragile that pride could feel when someone I loved and respected decided to tear at it publicly. Grandma, perched in her usual spot at the head of the living room, had that gleam in her eye, the one that meant she was about to say something sharp. I should have been prepared. I should have known that the jokes about my single life would come sooner or later. But even knowing it intellectually did little to brace me for the sting when she finally spoke. "Lila, when are you going to stop being so alone?" she said, her voice carrying across the room, deliberate and dripping with amusement. The laughter that followed from a few family members felt like a hammer hitting my chest. I froze, a blush creeping up my neck, my stomach twisting with a mix of humiliation and simmering anger. I wanted to speak, to defend myself, to remind her that my worth was not defined by my relationship status. But the words caught in my throat. I clenched my fists under the table, counting to 10 in my head, trying to summon the calm I had always told myself I possessed. Pride, identity, self-respect, they all felt like fragile glass right then, cracking under the weight of her public mockery. And yet, beneath the shock, there was something else, a quiet fire that started to grow. Anger mingled with disbelief, but I refused to let it break me. It wasn't just about being single. It was about being seen, acknowledged, and respected in a family that sometimes disguised criticism as humor. Every jab, every pointed laugh, chipped away at the careful confidence I carried with me every day. But I reminded myself that my choices, my life, my identity were mine to honor, not hers to belittle. I would not allow a single comment to erase the years of self-awareness, independence, and resilience I had built. As I sat there, forcing a polite smile while my heart raced, I knew something had shifted. This gathering would no longer be just about casual conversation and celebration. It had become a moment where I had to confront my own boundaries, where dignity and respect were no longer abstract ideals but urgent necessities. I realized that this family, even those closest to me, could challenge my confidence and push me to reevaluate the lines I would not allow anyone to cross. And so I watched, measured, waiting, feeling the simmering heat of determination rise in my chest. This was not the moment to retaliate or speak impulsively. It was the moment to take note, to remember every glance, every laugh, every word that cut too deep. I promised myself that this fire, this mix of humiliation, anger, and self-respect, would not consume me but empower me. If you've ever been teased by someone who should have lifted you up, then you know the sting. You know how it feels when pride and love collide with someone else's disregard. And if you have ever been in my shoes, feeling that humiliation bloom in a room full of familiar faces, then you understand why this moment mattered so much. Subscribe now if you've ever been teased by someone who should have lifted you up. You're not alone, and there is a way to turn their laughter into the fuel for your own dignity. I had always loved the warmth of family gatherings, the way laughter echoed off the walls and the smell of home-cooked meals filled the air. But even in those moments of apparent joy, there was always an undercurrent that I tried to ignore. Looking back now, I realized the seeds of tension had been planted long before that fateful afternoon with my grandmother. My name is Lila, and I have spent much of my life walking the tightrope between love and judgment, trying to navigate the fine line between respect and self-preservation. Grandma had always been a sharp woman, quick with her words and quicker with her criticisms. When I was younger, I remember her scrutinizing my clothing choices, my hairstyles, and even the way I spoke. "Lila, dear, are you sure that dress is appropriate?" she'd say, the words sweet on the surface but with a sting underneath that cut deeper than she likely intended. I would force a smile, nodding politely, hiding the small pang of hurt that would twist in my chest. I wanted to be the good granddaughter, the one who respected her elders, but it came at the cost of my own comfort and self-expression. There were countless dinners and holidays where her teasing would come out in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. A comment about my single status at Thanksgiving, a remark about my career choices during Christmas, or a pointed observation about my lifestyle that left me feeling exposed. Every time, I would laugh politely, redirect the conversation, or nod as if I agreed, even when my stomach knotted in anger or shame. I wanted to keep the peace, to maintain harmony in a family that I valued deeply, but I carried a quiet resentment that I tried not to show. I recall one particular afternoon when I had just returned from a promotion at work. Excited to share my news, I walked into the living room with a smile, expecting a few warm words, perhaps even pride. Instead, Grandma looked me up and down, then laughed softly before saying, "Well, Lila, that's nice, but don't let it make you think you're better than anyone else." The words stung, not because they were about my achievement, but because they subtly dismissed the effort, ambition, and pride I had felt. I smiled, nodded, and tried to brush it off, telling myself that she didn't mean harm. Yet inside, I felt a tightening, a flicker of anger that I quickly buried. Even my parents sometimes seemed to laugh along, brushing off her comments as harmless jokes or her way of showing love. But the more I tried to justify it in my head, the heavier the weight became. I realized I was constantly censoring myself, carefully choosing my words and actions to avoid another pointed remark or mockery. I measured every reaction, every laugh, and every comment, and I began to recognize a pattern, a recurring disrespect that I had learned to tolerate. I remember one summer barbecue when Grandma referred to my life choices in front of my cousins. "Lila's still focusing on herself," she said, as though my independence were a flaw. I forced a chuckle, nodded politely, and tried to redirect the conversation to a neutral topic. But later that night, I lay awake in my room, replaying the moment over and over, feeling both hurt and anger swelling inside me. I asked myself why the words mattered so much, why her laughter left me feeling small, and why I allowed it to. It was a question I would return to countless times in the years to come. Over time, I developed coping mechanisms. I learned to keep my distance when necessary, to smile even when it hurt, and to focus on the parts of family life that brought me joy. I became adept at hiding my discomfort, placing a polite shield over my emotions, and convincing myself that maintaining peace was worth the internal cost. Yet, deep down, I carried a simmering fire, a growing awareness that my dignity and self-respect mattered just as much as the comfort of others. There were moments when the tension felt unbearable, like the time she mocked my choice of career in front of my younger cousins. "Lila's going to spend her whole life at that desk," she said with a laugh, shaking her head. The room filled with chuckles, and I smiled, trying to hide my frustration, but my thoughts were sharp and clear. I thought about the years I had worked, the sacrifices I had made, the late nights and early mornings, and how easily they were minimized by a single careless sentence. I realized then that respect is not freely given, even by those who should love you unconditionally, and that some battles must be fought quietly until the right moment arrives. Despite the constant testing of my patience, I tried to maintain my composure. I reminded myself that love doesn't always look like praise and that sometimes the people we care about express affection through flawed humor or misguided remarks. But I also began to recognize that this was a pattern, not an isolated incident. Every slight, every misstep, every laugh at my expense was a thread in a larger tapestry of ongoing disrespect. It was subtle, insidious, and yet profoundly impactful. I spent countless hours reflecting on these moments, journaling my thoughts, and considering how I wanted to respond. I weighed the importance of family harmony against the imperative of self-respect. I thought about how my silence might be interpreted as weakness, and how my patience might be mistaken for complacency. Each recollection reinforced a growing understanding. I deserved to be treated with dignity, and I was capable of asserting it in ways that were thoughtful, deliberate, and impactful. Looking back now, it's clear that these early tensions were the foundation for what would come. They were lessons in recognizing patterns, in understanding the subtle ways people can diminish your presence, and in preparing for the moment when standing up for oneself becomes not just an option, but a necessity. I realized that I could not control how others behaved, but I could control my response, my boundaries, and the respect I demanded for myself. Have you ever felt judged by someone who should love you unconditionally? Have you ever smiled politely while your dignity was quietly undermined? These are not easy questions, and they are not easily answered. I know because I lived them, because I navigated years of careful observation, polite restraint, and simmering anger. And I learned, slowly but surely, that preparing to assert oneself does not make you harsh, it makes you aware, deliberate, and resilient. Being single has always been a part of my life, sometimes by choice, other times by circumstance. I had grown accustomed to my routines, my independence, and the quiet satisfaction of building my own path without compromise. Yet, as much as I valued my autonomy, there was an invisible weight I carried whenever family gatherings rolled around, a weight that pressed harder whenever my grandmother, Vanessa, or even other relatives, chose that moment to comment. It was never just a passing remark. It was a reminder, sharp and cutting, that my life did not align with the expectations they held. Lila, still enjoying that single life, my grandmother would say, tilting her head, her voice threaded with mockery. At first, I laughed along, trying to convince myself and everyone else that it was harmless. But deep inside, the laughter didn't reach me. It bounced off the walls of my self-esteem, leaving behind a subtle, lingering ache. I reflected often on why her words affected me so much. It wasn't because I lacked confidence in my life choices. It was because she was family, a person whose opinion I had valued my entire life. To be judged by someone who should celebrate you unconditionally feels different. It pierces in ways casual strangers never could. I found myself questioning, did she think my independence was a flaw? Did my choices threaten her image of success, of family cohesion? Or was it simply her way of asserting control in a world where she had little? The emotional impact was complex. On the one hand, I felt pride. I had worked hard to carve out a life that was meaningful to me, to embrace singlehood not as loneliness but as liberation. I had friends, passions, and ambitions that filled my days and gave my life depth. I had traveled, studied, and grown in ways that required independence, discipline, and self-trust. These were accomplishments no one could diminish, not even the sharpest tongue at the dinner table. And yet, on the other hand, there was insecurity. Repeated commentary from family, especially when delivered in public settings or with a casual laugh, planted seeds of doubt. Did my choices appear selfish or misguided? Was there something inherently wrong with the path I had chosen? I fought these thoughts fiercely, reminding myself of my worth, my achievements, and the deliberate life I had built. Still, the words echoed in quiet moments, like whispers I couldn't always control. I realized that my reaction was more than personal pride or embarrassment, it was about identity. Being singled out, mocked, or reduced to a stereotype of the single one challenged not just my social standing in the family but the core of who I was. I was not simply someone without a partner. I was Lila, a woman capable of building, creating, and thriving on her own terms. Every joke at my expense felt like an attempt to rewrite that truth, to paint me as incomplete, as needing validation I had never sought. There were times when I wanted to respond immediately, to correct the narrative with words sharp enough to echo through the room. But I hesitated. Family gatherings were delicate, and confrontation could unravel years of carefully maintained harmony. I balanced the desire to assert myself against the instinct to keep peace. Every time my grandmother spoke, I measured my options, respond and risk escalation, or endure silently and preserve decorum. Neither choice was without cost. I also reflected on how others treated me during these moments. My parents, siblings, and cousins often laughed along, brushing off the remarks as just teasing or grandma being grandma. Their laughter felt like a shield for her words, a collective shrug that implied my reaction was unnecessary, or worse, overblown. It left me isolated in a crowd, forced to defend my dignity silently while the room carried on. The more I noticed this dynamic, the more I understood that my struggle was not only against her words but against the passive complicity of those around us. As I sat quietly during one family dinner, listening to her jabs slip effortlessly between bites of food, I realized something vital. My self-worth could not depend on their understanding or approval. I could not allow their perception to define me. The pride I felt in my choices, the life I had intentionally crafted, was mine alone. Their mockery was a reflection of them, not of my value. This recognition was both liberating and painful. Liberating because it gave me clarity, painful because the reality of repeated disrespect had accumulated like a quiet storm inside me. I thought back to the countless small moments that had compounded over the years. A passing remark about dating apps, a sarcastic comment about career ambitions, the quiet shake of her head whenever I spoke about future goals. Each one, taken alone, seemed trivial. Together, they formed a tapestry of subtle undermining, a constant test of my patience and self-respect. And though I had endured them before, I sensed a threshold approaching, a breaking point that demanded recognition, not retaliation. Ultimately, I came to understand that my reflection was not only about the words spoken but about the power dynamics at play. To be laughed at by someone you respect, especially a family elder, forces you to negotiate between love, loyalty, and self-preservation. It teaches you which battles are worth fighting and which must be approached with strategy rather than impulse. I knew that enduring silence alone was not the solution, and neither was unchecked confrontation. A balance had to be found, a way to assert my identity, demand respect, and maintain dignity in a setting where emotions ran high and relationships were fragile. Have you ever defended your choices while being mocked? Have you ever felt pride in your independence while battling the sting of judgment? I had, countless times. And I realized that the next moment, when the right opportunity arrived, I would not simply endure. I would act with intention, ensuring that the years of quiet tolerance were acknowledged, and that my identity, my dignity, and my voice would not be ignored any longer. Over time, I began noticing the patterns in my grandmother's behavior. It wasn't just me she targeted, though I was often the easiest mark, but nearly everyone around her. She had a way of twisting compliments into comparisons, praising one cousin for their accomplishments while quietly undermining another. She would laugh at someone's idea, make a passing comment about someone's appearance, or subtly highlight mistakes in conversation, all in a tone so casual that most people didn't realize it was intentional. I remember one afternoon during a family gathering when my cousin Sarah proudly announced she had received a promotion at work. Grandma leaned back in her chair, a smile on her lips, and said, "Well, it's good she finally found something she could manage. Some people, unlike you, seem to get these things handed to them." Everyone laughed lightly, unsure whether to interpret it as humor or criticism. I saw Sarah's face tighten ever so slightly, and I felt a pang of recognition. I had worn that expression myself countless times. These moments were never outright attacks, they were subtle manipulations designed to assert control. I started keeping a mental tally, observing how she shifted attention, how she minimized achievements, and how she laughed just enough to make her words feel like jest. Her pattern was clear. She maintained power by making others feel lesser, by quietly sowing doubt, and by ensuring her opinions carried weight. I began to notice how she applied these tactics to me specifically. She would reference my single status during casual conversations with cousins, slipping it in as though it were a charming quip, when in reality, it was meant to provoke. She compared my life choices to other relatives, making me feel as if my independence and accomplishments were somehow inferior. At first, I questioned my perception, wondering if I was oversensitive or reading too much into harmless teasing. But over time, the recurrence became undeniable. This was not accidental, it was intentional, a habit she practiced to maintain dominance and elicit reactions. Coping became essential. I developed strategies to survive the gatherings without letting her words penetrate too deeply. Humor was my first tool. I would laugh along, deflecting attention and pretending the comments didn't matter. It was exhausting, like performing a delicate dance where one wrong step could result in exposure of my discomfort. Internally, I vented to myself, rehearsing responses I might deliver if I were braver or had more leverage. I imagined scenes where I called out her behavior directly, where I exposed the subtle cruelty for all to see, but the fear of escalation and family conflict kept me cautious. I also learned the art of patience. I realized that moments of control are often temporary. The quiet accumulation of disrespect builds tension, but it also creates the opportunity for a carefully considered response. I began documenting in my mind the instances that hurt, noting patterns in timing, audience, and delivery. This mental record wasn't about revenge, it was about understanding the dynamics, recognizing when and how to assert myself without losing dignity or harmony. What struck me most was the way others enabled her behavior, sometimes unknowingly. Cousins and aunts would laugh along, brushing off the remarks, while others remained silent. Their reactions reinforced her sense of authority. I felt the sting of isolation in those moments, Realizing that enduring her tactics required more than composure, it required an awareness of the social dynamics and a plan for when the right opportunity to respond would arise. Even so, I began noticing small victories. There were moments when her attempts to diminish me failed because I refused to internalize them. When she made a sly remark about my career, I kept my tone calm, responded with confidence, and continued speaking about my accomplishments. The subtle shift in energy was palpable. While she might still try to manipulate, I had begun reclaiming control over how her words affected me. Through observation, I also recognized that her behavior wasn't limited to me, it extended to anyone she perceived as vulnerable or less assertive. That realization helped me detach emotionally from some of her comments. Her patterns were her own, a reflection of control and insecurity, not a reflection of my worth. This awareness was empowering, even as it underscored the long road ahead in addressing the repeated undermining. I asked myself often, when is the right time to call out someone who repeatedly undermines you? How do you balance love, respect, and self-preservation with the need to assert boundaries? I knew that silence might preserve peace in the short term, but it also allowed the patterns to continue unchecked. Conversely, speaking up recklessly risked alienation, arguments, and escalation. I had to find a method that preserved my dignity, communicated my boundaries, and allowed me to reclaim my self-respect without sacrificing family ties entirely. By the end of that year, I realized that my grandmother's patterns had taught me a crucial lesson. Recognition of manipulation is the first step in reclaiming agency. Humor, patience, and observation became my tools, and while the sting of her words remained, I had begun to wield quiet power over my own reactions. I knew that one day, when the circumstances were right, I would have the chance to assert myself fully, not in anger, but with calculated dignity that demanded acknowledgement of my worth. Have you ever waited for the perfect moment to respond to someone who consistently undermines you? I had, countless times. And through every observation, every silently endured insult, I learned that preparation, awareness, and patience often hold more power than immediate confrontation. I was ready, not for a clash, but for the moment when my voice, long quiet, would finally be heard. The room buzzed with chatter, the aroma of home-cooked dishes filling every corner, and I tried to settle into the background, hoping to enjoy the family gathering without becoming the focal point of my grandmother's latest jabs. At 4 years old, my child, Eli, was a whirlwind of energy, curious, playful, and impossibly observant. He had an uncanny ability to notice what adults tried to disguise, to see through politeness, and to respond with the unfiltered honesty of a child. Eli clutched his small toy car in one hand as he weaved between legs and chairs, his laughter ringing like tiny bells. I watched him, feeling a swell of pride and affection. Even in moments when I felt diminished or invisible under my grandmother's teasing, Eli reminded me that love and joy could exist independently of her approval. His innocence was a quiet shield, a reminder that not all eyes measured me by her standards. As the evening progressed, I noticed the familiar patterns resurface. My grandmother leaned in, voice dripping with faux amusement. "Oh, Lila, you're still single? That must be so exciting." A few relatives chuckled politely, unsure whether to engage or let it pass. My chest tightened, that familiar heat of humiliation rising. I forced a smile and turned my attention back to Eli, who had paused mid-step and tilted his head, watching her with wide, unblinking eyes. It was as if he understood, even at 4, that something was off. He furrowed his small brow, looked up at me, and whispered, "Why is she saying that?" His voice was innocent but pointed, a mirror reflecting the absurdity of the statement. I crouched down to his level, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead, and whispered back, "Sometimes, people say things that aren't very nice, honey. But that's okay." I tried to keep my tone light, not wanting to burden him with the complexities of adult behavior, yet I also wanted him to recognize that words carry weight, and disrespect is real even when delivered casually. Eli's response surprised me. He puffed out his chest slightly, a tiny gesture of indignation, and asked aloud, "Why would she say that to Mommy?" His question drew a few heads in our direction. My grandmother's smile faltered for the briefest moment, though she tried to maintain her composure. I felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps Eli's candidness, his unfiltered observation, could interrupt the cycle of mockery, at least for a moment. Throughout the evening, Eli stayed close, hopping from one side of the room to another, never missing an opportunity to insert himself into the unfolding dynamics. He offered me water, helped clear small plates, and sometimes plopped down next to me, resting his tiny head against my arm. Every action was simple, yet profoundly grounding. I felt a quiet reassurance that I wasn't alone, not truly. Even when the world of adults attempted to diminish me, Eli's presence reminded me of my worth and my role as his mother. I watched as he began to mimic the gestures of the adults around him, including my grandmother. He copied the exaggerated laugh, the tilt of her head, and the tone she used when she spoke to me. It was playful at first, almost innocent mimicry, but the precision in his imitation began to sharpen the absurdity of her behavior. Each time he repeated her mocking cadence, I could feel the tension in the room shift ever so slightly. The laughter of bystanders became uneasy, a subtle acknowledgement that perhaps the child saw more than they wanted to admit. I realized, in that moment, that Eli's presence was catalytic. His honesty, unconstrained by social niceties, had the power to expose what I had endured silently for years. He didn't need to speak in anger or demand apologies. His mere observation, coupled with a single question or mimicry, was enough to disrupt the carefully maintained balance of mockery and control my grandmother had wielded. As dessert was being served, my grandmother returned to her usual commentary, attempting another dig. "Still no boyfriend, Lila? I suppose Eli is keeping you busy enough." I braced myself for the familiar pang of embarrassment, the forced smile, the internal argument about whether to respond. But before I could react, Eli looked up with wide eyes and a pointed finger, exclaiming, "Grandma, why are you making Mommy sad?" The room froze. Conversations halted mid-word. Adults glanced at each other, unsure whether to intervene or let the child speak. I felt a swell of pride mixed with relief. In one innocent statement, Eli had articulated everything I had felt yet struggled to convey. There was no malice in his words, only observation, honesty, and a child's innate sense of fairness. The power dynamic subtly shifted. I could see the flicker of discomfort in my grandmother's eyes, her composure momentarily cracking under the weight of truth delivered without judgment or strategy. Throughout the rest of the evening, I noticed how Eli's behavior continued to influence the room. He stayed near me, whispering occasional observations about fairness and kindness, nudging the adults to consider how their words affected others. I felt a quiet sense of justice, not one wrought by confrontation or retaliation, but by the simple, unfiltered presence of a child who refused to normalize disrespect. By the end of the night, I realized that the pivotal moment hadn't been a grand speech or an argument. It had been the subtle, powerful intervention of someone who saw clearly and spoke plainly. Eli had reminded everyone, including me, that dignity doesn't require a fight. Sometimes it requires only the courage to acknowledge truth, even in the voice of a 4-year-old. Have you ever watched a child observe adult behavior and say exactly what needed to be said? I had. And in that observation, I felt vindicated, empowered, and quietly relieved. For the first time in years, I wasn't alone in feeling the sting of mockery, and yet I was not powerless. I had thought the evening was progressing smoothly, a simple family gathering with laughter, chatter, and the smell of my aunt's famous lasagna wafting through the room. I had managed to keep my guard up, smiling politely through subtle jabs and backhanded compliments over the years. But as the dessert plates were being cleared, my grandmother, with a mischievous glint in her eye, turned to me and said, loud enough for the room to hear, "Still single, Lila? I guess some things never change." The words landed like a cold splash of water. My cheeks flushed instantly, a mix of embarrassment and simmering anger. The laughter that followed from a few relatives felt like a spotlight, illuminating all my insecurities, all the unspoken judgments I had carried quietly for years. My throat tightened, and for a moment I wanted nothing more than to vanish from the room, to escape the scrutiny, the ridicule, and the sense that my life was somehow a topic of amusement. I froze, caught between the instinct to respond and the effort to maintain composure. I could feel every eye in the room on me, waiting for my reaction, for the proverbial scene to unfold. I wanted to snap, to throw back a cutting remark that would shut her down instantly. Instead, I inhaled deeply, forcing myself to stay seated, to breathe through the sting of her words. My fingers fidgeted with the hem of my dress, a small grounding action to remind myself I was still in control. The room's energy shifted. Some guests glanced awkwardly at one another, unsure whether to laugh along or show sympathy. I could sense the tension thickening, like a storm waiting to break. My mind raced, replaying her words, analyzing them for hidden cruelty, questioning why they always seemed to land in such a perfectly humiliating way. It wasn't just the statement itself, it was the timing, the delivery, the casual assumption that everyone would find it funny. My anger began to simmer, coiling in my chest. I wanted to rise up and defend my choices, to remind everyone that being single was not a flaw, that it didn't define my worth. But part of me hesitated. The family gathering was meant to be light-hearted, and I didn't want to be the one to spoil it. Yet, I also realized that remaining silent felt like submitting to disrespect, like allowing her words to diminish me. I glanced toward my parents, seeking a flicker of support, an acknowledgement that this was cruel. But they seemed caught off guard, unsure how to react. A few cousins giggled nervously, clearly uncomfortable, while others avoided my gaze entirely. I felt a pang of loneliness in the realization that my humiliation had been normalized by the people around me for years. My grandmother's teasing was more than habitual. It had become a performance, and I had been the unwilling audience. My child, Eli, was beside me, sensing my discomfort immediately. He tugged at my sleeve, looking up with wide, earnest eyes. "Mummy, why did she say that?" His innocence cut through the tension like a knife, a reminder that the words thrown at me were not just public entertainment, they carried weight and consequence. I bent down, brushing his hair from his forehead, and whispered, "Sometimes people say hurtful things, Eli. But we know who we are, and that's what matters." Even as I comforted him, my mind refused to settle. The sting of her words mixed with the pride I felt in raising a child who recognized wrongness, who questioned injustice without fear. I realized that the humiliation she sought to inflict on me could be softened, perhaps even countered, by the awareness that someone else saw clearly, someone whose heart and loyalty were completely aligned with mine. I noticed subtle shifts around the room. Aunts and uncles exchanged glances. A few cousins avoided eye contact with my grandmother, the laughter dying down as the tension became tangible. It was as if my child's quiet awareness and my internal refusal to be diminished had begun to crack the carefully constructed facade of amusement that my grandmother relied on. The room was no longer just a stage for her wit, it had become a space of reflection, where people could see the impact of her words. At that moment, I realized the importance of measured response. I didn't need to escalate the situation with sharp words or public confrontation. The power of her comment, meant to wound, had already revealed itself in the discomfort it generated among witnesses and in the clarity it gave me. I could sit with my dignity intact, hold my head high, and allow the natural consequences of her behavior to unfold. Still, the emotional intensity was undeniable. My cheeks were flushed, my chest tight, and a low hum of anger coursed through me. I could feel the pulse of indignation, a readiness to assert myself when the moment allowed. I made a mental note. This wouldn't pass without acknowledgement. I wouldn't let the pattern continue unchecked. The sting of embarrassment could be transformed into motivation, a quiet resolve to ensure that respect was recognized, not demanded. By the time the evening wound down, I had navigated the mockery with careful composure, yet I knew the pivotal moment was still approaching. My child's presence, the reactions of other family members, and my own internal resolve had set the stage for what needed to happen next. I understood that dignity wasn't just about surviving her words, it was about reclaiming authority over my own narrative, showing that hurt could be acknowledged without surrendering self-worth. Have you ever felt the sharp sting of someone laughing at you in front of others, especially someone who should protect and love you? I had. And in that sting, I found the seed of empowerment, a quiet determination that the next moments would belong to me, shaped not by humiliation but by self-respect and strategic response. After my grandmother's words hung in the air, I felt the immediate rush of embarrassment, but I also sensed a subtle shift in the room. Laughter had faded into an uneasy silence. I instinctively leaned back in my chair, taking a step inward mentally, observing every movement, every expression, every flicker of reaction. I needed to understand the dynamics before acting. Eli, my 4-year-old, was beside me, his tiny hands fidgeting with the hem of my dress as he studied my grandmother. His brows were furrowed in concentration, his eyes scanning her face as if decoding a secret message only he could interpret. It struck me in that moment how attuned he was, how much children notice when adults assume they do not. Eli had been watching all along, the smirks, the subtle gestures, the casual dismissals I had endured silently over the years. He was processing it differently than I had, but his awareness was palpable, and I could see a spark of determination in his gaze. I took a slow breath, reminding myself to stay composed. My immediate urge was to defend myself, to launch a verbal counterattack that would silence the mockery instantly. But I also knew that reacting impulsively would diminish the impact of what was about to unfold. There was power in restraint, and right now, Eli's presence and perception had turned the tables in a way I could not yet articulate. He was ready to take the lead in his own small, extraordinary way, and I had to let him. As I watched, I noticed other family members shifting in their seats. Some exchanged glances, realizing that the laughter had crossed a line, that the comment was no longer a joke but an attack on dignity. Aunts and uncles avoided eye contact with my grandmother. Even cousins who had chuckled moments ago now sat a little straighter, unsure how to respond. It was as if the atmosphere itself had altered, a collective recognition that humor at someone's expense carried consequences. Internally, I struggled with conflicting impulses. Part of me wanted to speak up, to assert that my grandmother's words were unacceptable. Another part of me wanted to step back entirely, to let Eli navigate the situation in his own way. I realized that he had already absorbed the lesson in fairness, in standing up for others, in recognizing injustice, and that my restraint could allow him to demonstrate that lesson in real time. Eli's movements were subtle but deliberate. He leaned slightly forward, eyes locked on my grandmother. His fingers twitched slightly on the edge of my dress, a tiny sign of anticipation. I could almost feel his thought process. This is not right. I need to say something. I suppressed a smile, proud of his awareness, yet also acutely aware that what he was about to do could shift the entire energy of the room. I mentally reviewed the past few family gatherings, replaying instances of his grandmother's mockery. Each small dig, each dismissive remark, each backhanded comment that had punctuated conversations over the years now formed a pattern that Eli had absorbed intuitively. It was astounding to realize that even at 4, he could connect the dots, perceive the unfairness, and prepare to act with courage I had sometimes struggled to summon myself. As I observed, I felt my own tension ebb slightly. I realized that my dignity did not require immediate confrontation. It could be asserted through measured, purposeful actions. Eli's presence had created a space for the lesson to unfold naturally, without the need for my words to dominate the room. It was an unusual reversal, a small child leading the charge while I silently reinforced the boundary of respect. I watched my grandmother as she continued speaking, oblivious to the storm brewing beside her. She laughed at a minor anecdote, seemingly unaware that Eli's attention had sharpened, that his gaze carried an unspoken challenge. The tension in the room was thickening subtly, almost imperceptibly, yet I could sense its weight. Every family member's posture, every twitch of attention, was a reflection of anticipation, curiosity, and an undercurrent of expectation. Inside, I wrestled with my own emotions. I felt pride in my child, admiration for his instinct to confront injustice, and yet I was also bracing myself. What if the situation escalated in an unforeseen way? What if my grandmother reacted with anger, defensiveness, or tears? I had to be ready to support Eli, to maintain composure, and to guide him gently if needed. But more importantly, I needed to trust him, to allow his innocence and honesty to teach the lesson that had eluded my words for years. As the seconds stretched, I could almost hear the internal dialogue between mother and child. Let him speak. Let him take the lead. I reminded myself that this moment was bigger than embarrassment. It was about fairness, dignity, and the subtle power of truth delivered from a place of authenticity. Eli had already internalized a principle that so many adults struggle to apply: the courage to assert what is right, even when it is uncomfortable. I watched as a faint tremor passed over my grandmother's features. It was slight, almost imperceptible, but it signaled that the universe of family dynamics had shifted. My child had noticed, and the room had begun to notice as well. The anticipation was palpable. Every breath seemed slower, every eye sharper, every gesture loaded with unspoken expectation. At that moment, I realized the power of patience and observation. I had spent years enduring subtle slights, pretending they didn't matter, suppressing my reactions to maintain peace. Yet here, through Eli's innocent yet piercing attention, the lesson could be delivered without rancor, without a raised voice. Respect would be asserted, boundaries would be communicated, and dignity would be maintained, all through observation, restraint, and a child's unfiltered truth. I leaned back slightly, my hands resting calmly in my lap. The tension coiled in my chest had transformed into readiness. I knew that the next moment, when Eli spoke, would be decisive. And I felt confident, not in myself alone, but in the remarkable awareness and courage of my child. Have you ever observed a situation so carefully that you could feel the power of timing, restraint, and support? I had. And in this quiet observation, I realized that sometimes the most powerful lessons are delivered not through anger or confrontation, but through awareness, presence, and the courage to let truth shine through, even in the smallest, youngest voice. I held my breath, silently urging Eli to remain calm as he studied my grandmother. There was a tension in the room that had thickened with every passing second since her mocking comment. I felt my own pulse racing, unsure whether the small gathering would descend into awkward silence or erupt in commentary. I knew that words were about to carry more weight than they ever had before, and I trusted Eli to wield them with the kind of innocence that hits harder than sarcasm ever could. Eli shifted slightly in his chair, looking up at my grandmother with wide, curious eyes. He cocked his head, a gesture I had seen countless times when he was trying to figure out something that didn't make sense. This was one of those moments. I could almost hear the gears turning in his 4-year-old mind. I felt a mixture of pride, anticipation, and nervousness, knowing that whatever he said next would pierce the casual disregard my grandmother had shown me for years. Then, in his small, clear voice, he asked the question, "Grandma, why do you say Lila is alone if she has us?" The room froze. My grandmother's mouth opened slightly, then closed, as if she had not expected words so pointed, so innocent, to land with such undeniable force. The question was simple, almost naive, and yet it revealed a truth she had been trying to skirt around for years. Her laughter and casual jabs, which had always seemed harmless in front of others, were suddenly exposed as cruel and unnecessary. I felt a warmth of pride in my chest, mixed with a rush of relief. This was the moment I had silently hoped for, when truth, delivered without malice, would speak louder than my repeated attempts at patience and restraint. I saw my aunts and uncles exchange looks, some smiling in surprise, others nodding subtly, recognizing the sharp insight from a child that none of us adults had managed to articulate. The power of innocence was extraordinary. My grandmother's face flushed. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, caught off guard by the piercing clarity of the question. I realized she had not considered that her behavior, when observed so keenly by someone so small and unfiltered, could be reflected back with such accuracy. Her casual jokes and subtle dismissals were suddenly laid bare, stripped of all pretense. Eli's gaze remained steady. He did not laugh, he did not smile mischievously. He simply asked the question, leaving space for everyone in the room to absorb it. And absorb it we did. The air shifted. The awkward tension that had been simmering now felt palpable. People leaned forward slightly in their chairs, some adjusting their posture as if preparing to witness a family reckoning of sorts. I couldn't help but feel an emotional swell of gratitude and awe for Eli. Here was a child who had not yet learned social manipulation, who had not been jaded by the subtle politics of family gatherings, who spoke with unfiltered honesty. His words held the weight of moral clarity, of justice, and of protection for someone he loved. I felt an immense pride, realizing that sometimes the youngest voices cut through the pretenses that adults fail to dismantle for years. My grandmother's cheeks burned, and for a moment her eyes darted around the room as though searching for an ally or an escape route. There was a faint quiver in her lips, a hesitation I had never witnessed before. The room had shifted on its axis, the casual amusement she once elicited from family members now replaced with quiet recognition of her misstep. Guests murmured softly among themselves, acknowledging the audacity and accuracy of a 4-year-old's observation. I noticed Eli's small hands clutching the edge of the table, and I silently encouraged him with my eyes. He had done it perfectly, not confrontational, not spiteful, not boastful, just honest, fearless, and poignant. The emotional weight of the room settled on my grandmother. She laughed nervously at first, a weak attempt to reclaim control, but even that faltered because everyone present had seen the truth reflected in the simple, innocent question. For a fleeting second, I allowed myself to relive years of enduring her subtle digs, the constant undermining, and the feeling of invisibility I had carried at family events. And then I let it go. Eli had said what needed to be said. He had done what I could not articulate without fear of escalation. And in his small act, he had affirmed my dignity, my value, and my rightful place in this family. I felt tears prick the corners of my eyes, not from anger, but from a profound sense of relief. The energy in the room had shifted completely, from discomfort and tension to recognition, respect, and a gentle, undeniable truth. Even my younger cousins, who had been watching the exchange with wide-eyed curiosity, seemed to understand that something significant had just occurred, a small child speaking with the wisdom of honesty that even adults struggle to embrace. My grandmother finally responded, her voice quieter than usual. She attempted a joke, a soft deflection, but it fell flat. The gravity of Eli's question had settled over her, leaving her momentarily speechless. I watched her, knowing that the words would linger in her mind far longer than she expected. I felt an unspoken satisfaction, not from humiliation, but from the justice of clarity. I looked down at Eli and smiled, squeezing his tiny shoulder gently. He turned to me briefly, eyes bright with understanding, as if to say, I did what needed to be done. I nodded silently, sharing in the quiet victory that had required no confrontation from me, only patience, observation, and trust in the power of an innocent truth. As the room began to relax, laughter cautiously returning, I realized that lessons sometimes arrive in unexpected forms. A child's honesty can pierce pretension, correct injustice, and command attention in ways adults rarely anticipate. Eli had reminded everyone present that respect is not optional, that words matter, and that the smallest voice can carry the heaviest weight when truth is its foundation. I watched as my grandmother froze. Her usual composure, the poised smile she wore like armor at every gathering, faltered completely. For the first time in memory, she was speechless, caught off guard by a truth she hadn't expected to hear from anyone, let alone a 4-year-old. I could see the heat rise to her cheeks, the quick blink of eyes trying to regain control of a situation that had spun beyond her practiced social grace. She cleared her throat awkwardly, attempting a laugh that sounded brittle and forced. It lacked the warmth and confidence she usually projected. I sat quietly, hands folded, heart steady, giving her space to recover while knowing that no amount of charm or deflection could undo the reality Eli had spoken aloud. The room held its collective breath, sensing the shift from casual family chatter to a moment of undeniable accountability. I thought about all the times she had undermined me, the subtle digs that chipped away at my confidence, and the laughter that accompanied her comments at my expense. The memories flickered through my mind like old photographs, the family dinners where she would tease me about my relationship status, the holidays where her words undercut my efforts, the small but pointed remarks that made me feel like an outsider in my own home. I had endured them all, mostly silently, because confrontation often came with emotional costs I wasn't willing to bear. But now, everything has changed. I didn't need to speak a single word. I didn't need to craft a carefully measured response or call her out directly. The lesson had arrived naturally, delivered through innocence and honesty that no adult defense could refute. I felt a swell of quiet satisfaction, not from malice, but from justice finally landing in a way that mirrored the respect I had long deserved. My grandmother shifted in her seat, a faint tremor in her hands as she tried to gather herself. She attempted to redirect attention, making a joke about something else entirely, but it fell flat. I could see the subtle shift in her demeanor, the way she no longer carried the unassailable authority she so often wielded, the way her eyes darted to family members for support or reassurance that would not come. Even my parents, who usually acted as intermediaries to soften her remarks, sat silently, recognizing that this time the lesson had come without the need for adult intervention. I reflected on the years I had spent tolerating her behavior, trying to be polite, patient, and understanding. There had been a part of me that questioned whether enduring these comments silently was a form of weakness or a necessary exercise in humility. But as I observed the subtle unease and discomfort she now displayed, I realized that patience and restraint, combined with trust in the right moment, could speak louder than confrontation ever could. Eli had unknowingly delivered what I had long wanted to convey, that respect is earned, and words matter. The room began to settle, the initial shock transforming into whispers and quiet laughter. I noticed a few family members glancing at me with soft smiles. A silent acknowledgement of the shift that had just occurred. I didn't smile too broadly. I didn't want to appear as though I were gloating. Instead, I let the moment unfold naturally, savoring the fact that the lesson had been learned in its own time, without my interference. I thought about humility, both mine and my grandmother's. There was power in restraint, in allowing someone to witness the consequences of their actions without forcing it upon them. I felt a profound sense of empowerment in knowing that I had honored my own dignity, that I had not stooped to sarcasm or retaliation. The truth, delivered through innocence, had done the work for me. I also reflected on the nature of justice. Justice is not always about confrontation or punishment. Sometimes, it is about timing, observation, and letting the natural course of events reveal truth. Eli had been the perfect messenger, untainted by the complexities and politics that adults often allow to cloud judgment. In his small, honest question, the culmination of years of disrespect was exposed in a way that was undeniable, immediate, and clear. My grandmother finally spoke, attempting a feeble recovery. Her words stumbled, punctuated by nervous laughter, and I noticed the faint shadow of embarrassment in her posture. She tried to redirect the conversation, but the room had already shifted allegiance, even if silently. The energy was no longer hers to command. She had lost her unchallenged authority, and I felt a quiet, steady sense of vindication. As I watched, I considered the lessons I wanted Eli to take away from this moment. Life is not always fair, and disrespect sometimes comes from those we love. But wisdom, courage, and clarity, no matter how small the source, can correct imbalance and restore dignity. I wanted him to know that even the most subtle injustices could be addressed in a way that preserves integrity and avoids unnecessary conflict. The family gathering resumed its rhythm slowly, but the room had changed. There was an unspoken understanding now, a recognition of limits and boundaries. My grandmother's usual commentary had lost its sting, replaced by a quiet awareness that the times of unchallenged mockery were over. I felt a profound sense of relief, knowing that respect had been reasserted, not through anger or confrontation, but through observation, patience, and the perfect timing of a child's voice. Would you seize the moment to teach a lesson, or let humility do it for you? I had chosen the latter, allowing the weight of truth and innocence to do what words alone could not. I realized that sometimes, the most powerful statements are made not by raising one's voice, but by remaining poised, measured, and confident while letting the natural consequences unfold. By the end of the gathering, I felt an unusual lightness. Years of subtle disrespect and underhanded remarks had been acknowledged without drama or harsh words from me. The room had witnessed a quiet form of justice, one that reaffirmed dignity and shifted the dynamics in a subtle but undeniable way. I walked away knowing that my integrity and patience had spoken louder than any argument could, and that the respect I deserved had been restored, not through confrontation, but through timing, truth, and the clarity of a 4-year-old's observation. The room had quieted after the moment of confrontation, though not completely. There was a low hum of whispers, the soft shuffle of feet, and the occasional clink of cutlery as people tried to resume normal conversation. I could feel the subtle shifts around me, like ripples in water after a stone has been dropped. Guests who had once laughed lightly at my grandmother's jabs now avoided joining in, glancing at me with hesitant acknowledgement. Some smiled in quiet support, a glance, a tilt of the head, a subtle nod that said, without words, "I see you. I get it." Others looked uncomfortable, unsure where to position themselves in this suddenly altered dynamic. I let myself observe quietly. There was no need to speak, no need to justify my feelings or my child's timely intervention. The truth had already been laid bare in the most unassailable way. My pride swelled, not in arrogance, but in validation. The years of patience, the attempts to maintain harmony in a house often fraught with judgment, had not gone unnoticed. Even if some family members had never verbalized their support before, their subtle reactions now told me that respect had shifted in my favor. I thought about the delicate threads of family relationships. They are not always easily broken, but they can shift imperceptibly in moments of honesty. A glance, a shared expression, a moment of realization can alter how people perceive one another. I could feel it happening. Those who had previously allowed the grandmother's mocking comments to pass with laughter or silence were now reconsidering. I could see it in the way they tilted their heads when she spoke, the slight pause before offering a response, the hesitation to join in the old patterns of ridicule. It was empowering to witness. I realized that asserting dignity does not always require confrontation. Sometimes, it requires allowing the world to see truth unadorned. The child had done this unknowingly, with innocence, and in doing so, had shifted the dynamic for everyone present. I felt a quiet sense of triumph, but not in a way that needed to humiliate anyone. The lesson had landed gently, yet firmly, and its effects would linger in subtle ways beyond this gathering. I allowed myself a moment to breathe, to release the tension that had coiled within me for weeks, months, even years. All the past humiliations, the whispered jabs, the laughter at my expense, they no longer carried their full weight. In that moment, I reclaimed a part of myself that had been tested repeatedly but never broken. I could feel my self-worth anchored in a place that no casual comment could unsettle. The grandmother tried to regain composure, offering awkward smiles, attempting to redirect the conversation with humor that fell flat. I noticed the strain in her posture, the faltering cadence of her voice, and the slight avoidance in her gaze. She was trying to reclaim control, but control had already shifted subtly. People were beginning to recognize that my voice, my presence, and my dignity could not be dismissed so easily. I reflected on my own behavior through the years, on my patience, my composure, and the silent endurance of minor humiliations. I had often questioned whether staying polite in the face of repeated disrespect made me weak or strong. Now, seeing the subtle acknowledgement and changed perception of others, I understood that strength is not always loud or visible. Strength is sometimes measured in the calm that follows a storm, in the ability to allow a moment of truth to settle naturally and effect change without aggression. I watched my child, unknowingly pivotal in this shift, continue to play quietly nearby. The innocence that had exposed the harshness of words now radiated back to me as a sense of validation. I realized that moments like this, where dignity is quietly restored, can leave a lasting impression not just on those who were, but also on the observers who witness respect being reclaimed. Some guests approached me gently, offering quiet words of understanding. That was remarkable. One whispered, eyes soft with empathy. Another nodded subtly, saying nothing, but the glance alone spoke volumes. Each small interaction reinforced the internal validation I felt, the knowledge that asserting dignity can be accomplished without hostility, without raising one's voice, without needing to overpower others. I also considered the ripple effects beyond this room. Family gatherings, conversations, and even subtle decisions in the future would likely be influenced by this moment. The grandmother's ability to mock without consequence had been interrupted. Others who had witnessed or participated in past humor at my expense were now aware that respect and attentiveness must be part of every interaction. I felt a quiet assurance that boundaries, once asserted, even through indirect means, could transform the way people engage with me over time. As the evening wore on, the atmosphere began to normalize. Laughter returned, stories were shared, and the usual background noise of family interactions resumed. Yet beneath it all, I sensed a new undercurrent, a respect, subtle but unmistakable, that had been absent before. I smiled quietly, knowing that the lesson was not over. It had merely begun. The awareness seated in that room would grow, even if imperceptibly, and it had started with a child's honest question and my measured response. I reflected on my own empowerment. For years, I had allowed words to sting, for fear of confrontation or familial tension. Now I understand that dignity does not require aggression, only clarity, observation, and the courage to let the natural consequences of actions manifest. I felt the liberation of knowing that I could protect my self-respect without lowering myself to match the disrespect I had endured. Would you reclaim dignity when it's been challenged publicly? I had done so not through anger, not through shouting, not through confrontation, but through restraint, observation, and allowing truth to reveal itself in the right moment. I had turned humiliation into empowerment and embarrassment into subtle justice, and in doing so, I had restored a sense of self-worth that no words or mockery could take away. By the time the gathering came to a close, I felt lighter than I had in years. The subtle shifts in family dynamics, the quiet acknowledgments of support, and the internal sense of regained pride combined to create a profound emotional release. I knew the impact of this evening would extend beyond this single event. Respect, once restored, has a way of subtly altering interactions, of redefining boundaries, and of ensuring that the dignity of those who deserve it is recognized. I left the room with my head held high, pride in my chest, and a calm certainty that I had done what was necessary. I had allowed patience, observation, and the clarity of truth to speak louder than confrontation ever could. And for the first time in a long time, I felt the complete weight of self-respect restored. As the echoes of laughter and whispers faded from the family gathering, I found myself sitting quietly, reflecting on everything that had transpired. My mind traced the path from years of subtle jabs to the sudden, astonishing intervention of my 4-year-old. Each memory felt heavy with both discomfort and revelation. For so long, I had tried to maintain a delicate balance, being polite, patient, and understanding, even when the words directed at me carried sting. I had asked myself countless times if it was worth tolerating the quiet mockery for the sake of family harmony. That evening, the answer became unmistakably clear: respect is not optional, and boundaries are essential. Watching my child speak with innocent clarity and expose my grandmother's rudeness, I realized that wisdom does not always come with age. The question posed so simply, yet with such honesty, shifted the room in ways I could not have forced. I could feel the subtle change in energy, the slight hesitation in conversations, and the fleeting discomfort that lingered in my grandmother's posture. It was a quiet victory, one that reaffirmed the principle that sometimes innocence carries more power than experience, that authenticity can speak louder than confrontation. I reflected on the countless moments in the past where I had been misnamed, teased, or judged in ways that chipped away at my confidence. The small cracks of discomfort had accumulated over time, a steady undercurrent of tension that I had learned to navigate silently. Each event, however minor it seemed to others, had been a test of patience and composure. I had tried to maintain my dignity, reminding myself that responding with anger would only escalate conflicts, yet deep down, I craved acknowledgement, validation, and fairness. The child's intervention illuminated the truth in a way I could not have orchestrated. It was a reminder that standing firm in one's values does not always require force. Sometimes, clarity, observation, and allowing others' actions to speak for themselves achieve more than words ever could. The room's reactions, the subtle acknowledgement of guests, and even the grandmother's tentative recovery all reinforced a lesson I had been learning my whole life. Respect must be earned, not assumed. I also reflected on my role as a parent. I wanted to nurture kindness, empathy, and courage in my child, and in a moment of unintentional brilliance, these traits surfaced in a way that reinforced the values I held dear. I felt a swell of pride, not only for the lesson delivered to my grandmother but also for witnessing how character and integrity can emerge in even the youngest members of a family. It reminded me that teaching through example, patience, and subtle influence often yields profound results. The moral of the evening crystallized in my mind with striking clarity. Life is full of people who will test your patience, mock your choices, or underestimate your worth. The way you respond, through restraint, observation, and measured action, defines your character more than any sharp retort ever could. And yet, there is power in the unexpected, in moments where others' assumptions are gently, yet firmly, overturned. That power is not born from aggression, but from composure, dignity, and the wisdom to let truth speak. I considered the future. The family dynamics in the room had subtly shifted. I could see it in the way relatives engaged with both me and my grandmother, in the slight pause before making comments, and in the softened tones of conversation. The lesson had been delivered without malice, without bitterness, yet it left an imprint that would influence interactions for years to come. I felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing that I had maintained my integrity while allowing a moment of truth to correct what years of subtle disrespect had left unchecked. This reflection also made me acknowledge the value of patience and measured action in personal growth. I had spent years tolerating minor humiliations, all while striving to be a kind, understanding presence in my family. The evening showed me that self-respect does not require confrontation alone. It also requires the ability to observe, assess, and allow the natural consequences of others' behavior to manifest. There is a profound strength in quiet composure and in trusting that the truth, when revealed, carries its own weight. As I looked at my child's innocent face, still unaware of the impact of her question, I realized that life often presents unexpected teachers. Sometimes, the most meaningful lessons come from the simplest sources, from the unassuming voices that speak truth without artifice. I felt a renewed sense of purpose, not only in protecting my dignity but also in nurturing an environment where honesty, respect, and integrity are valued and demonstrated. If someone mocked your life choices, could you stay composed, or would you feel compelled to make them learn their lesson? That question now lingered in my mind, a challenge not just to me but to everyone who values self-respect. It reminded me that dignity is not something others grant. It is something we uphold through our actions, our choices, and our unwavering sense of self-worth. For anyone who has ever felt belittled, ignored, or undervalued, know that you can assert your boundaries without compromising your integrity. Wisdom, composure, and occasionally a touch of unexpected intervention can restore equilibrium and earn respect in ways words alone may never achieve. The evening had been a powerful lesson. Sometimes the quietest actions, the simplest truths, and the most innocent voices carry the weight needed to reclaim dignity and reshape dynamics. Subscribe now for more stories of family, respect, and life lessons. Share below. Has a child ever stunned someone into realizing their words mattered? I invite you to reflect, comment, and join a community that celebrates standing firm in dignity and learning when composure speaks louder than confrontation.